I was hoping this was sort of the bait that they would bite, but they just had too much character drama going on if they didn't really bite the hook. No sooner had the commander's tent entered the presence of his potency, the crown immovable, son of earth, father of orcs, Throka Thrak, keeper of the cradle, lord of beast and blood and bone, than Throka Thrak flinched. It seems that Umber forgot to leave all of his metal behind and revealed a single coin, enough to aggravate Throka Thrak's unusual condition. It was not an auspicious beginning to their audience with the great Thrak, and his companions attempted to show more deference. One by one, Throka Thrak greeted the mercenaries, each in their turn. Chimera blushed and stammered in his presence, made uncharacteristically sheepish by this reunion with her old lover. While Throka Thrak acknowledged Remoraz politely, he was intrigued by Griffin, seeming to recognize something in him that even the Slayer did not recognize in himself. To Umber, the Thrak was colder, and it quickly became clear that father and son had not parted on the best of terms. It was at that moment, however, that a falcon messenger, its plumage dark as wine, arrived to deliver Throka Thrak an ultimatum. Indeed, the cities of the Schism had sent him a dust falcon, a symbolic invitation for one last parley before inevitable war. When asked about the origins of the conflict, Throka Thrak told a tale of Harashtan's spies, disguised as envoys, who came to steal a sample of the cradle's unique soil, and who, upon discovery, were executed. Agreeing to sign a contract with the Cradle for 1 year, the menagerie took this invitation, ventured to the small town of Circlestones, and negotiate with the cities as their first task. Before they took their lead, Throka Thrak bade Umber to stay a moment for a private word. He introduced him to his Shareg, or his Rememberer, the Corv's official historian. Once a childhood friend of Umber's, Throka Hairhaste was now a stooped crone, bent beneath her responsibilities as the Corv's historian, responsibilities that Umber shirked as a young man. As the child of two Thraks, Umber was blessed with unnatural long life, and was therefore expected to inherit this role, to become the Corv's historian, but he chose instead the mercenary life. As Throka Hairhaste now neared death, Throka Thrak urged Umber to reconsider his role in the mercenary company and in the larger world. That night, the orcs of the Kostrak Burg invited the menagerie to a traditional orcish welcoming celebration called a fire feast. So named for the enormous cook fires that dotted the field, each orcish family of the Corv invited a handful of mercenaries to come and share their fire, and share their food, and to share their stories with them. Much meat was eaten, much taunch, an orcish booze made from fermented milk was drunk, and much camaraderie was kindled between company and Corv that night. While Chimera, Griffin, and Remoraz were invited to share a fire with Throka Manymother, the Thrak's pretty young wife, Remoraz instead sought out Displacer, who was carving a dragon's eye talisman to ward against evil spirits, and he encouraged her to come and join the festivities. Umber took his leave of the celebration to find a quiet moment with Dunya Dragonbane, and coming to terms, the two agreed to part amicably. Griffin, meanwhile, was approached about using his shape-shifting skills to participate in a game of Khla, an orcish sport that usually involves a lycanthrope, but he rebuffed them for his own reasons. When the commander's tent, accompanied by half a unit of their artillery, prepared to leave the cradle and make for Circlestones, who should approach them but Throka Steelsword, Umber's childhood bully, to inform them that the Thrak demanded that he accompany them, to ensure that they did not endanger any of the cradle's concerns at the upcoming negotiation. And that's where we ended the session. How did it go? I felt it was a pretty good session. It was one of those sessions that felt more like a collection of small scenes than it did like any one contiguous narrative. I was initially worried about pacing and whether I would have enough material. I'm always worried about that, and it never turns out to be a problem. But it actually timed out almost perfectly. It should be noted as well that Kate, as Unicorn, was not present for this session, and likely will not be present for the next session as well. So they're going to have a little bit of catching up to do when they come back. So the backbone of the session was definitely the big introduction scene for Throka Thrak. That took 90 minutes, half of the session. By the time they were done, we took our break and then did everything else in the second half. So there was a lot to get there. I had this big checklist of all the important points to make. The first thing I want to talk about is Throka Thrak's condition, where he has this like strange sort of like anxiety or panic around worked metal. It was inspired by anyone who's watching Better Call Saul and his brother Charlie's condition. So I started the session by having everyone make an investigation check. If anyone failed, which Umber did, then they had forgotten to remove some piece of metal from their person, whether it was a buckle or a watch or, whatever it is. And so it ended up being Umber, which worked out great because he was already kind of on the rocks with Throka Thrak as it was, so it just reinforced that, which was cool. I wanted to have him have slightly different reactions to everybody. He obviously has this history with Chimera, but he wanted to sort of be polite to her because he is currently sort of married to Throka Many-Mother. And I wanted to even remember Remoraz and refer to Remoraz by their proper name, Iorthe, which is their elven name, and not something that gets used very much in the company, who tends to use like sort of call signs. Griffin was interesting. I wanted to have the Thrak be particularly intrigued by Griffin and interested in him. And nobody really managed to figure out exactly why that was, which I think is great. It's one of those things that is not that hard to figure out, but it's one of the big secrets moving in the background of the campaign. The idea is that Throka Thrak recognizes that he is Yorgos' son. Just like Chimera has a history with both Yorgos and Throka Thrak has a history with both Chimera and Yorgos. And so he detects kind of far off the influence of Yorgos of Nair. What that means particularly, I might not say because our players might be watching, but I spoke to Hallie afterward and she didn't seem to pick up on that necessarily beyond the fact that Throka Thrak was just interested in Griffin. So that's great. That secret is safe and will hopefully remain secret for a little while longer. The other big part of this scene I wanted to play with was the scene between Umber and Throka Shareg. One of Steven's ideas for his character was that Umber is this kind of irresponsible sort of lout, right, who goes around, drinking and fighting and not really taking responsibility for anything. So to drive that home, he wanted to have there be some big task, some big responsibility that he had basically ignored back home among the orcs of the Throka Corv. And so that was the idea of like something that he really wouldn't want to do. I liked the notion that because the orcs have such short lifespans, they would have to have someone whose job it was to remember everything and like keep records. I externalized that as this very complicated braiding system where the Shareg, or the Rememberer, has this kind of shorthand that they braid into their very long hair, and then once the hair gets to a certain length, they cut it off and they store it somewhere. So it's this like complicated woven knot pattern, which I thought was interesting, right? It's like he was almost the stenographer in the scene, just kind of braiding everything that was being said and putting beads in it and stuff. But the idea was that Throka Shareg is an old woman now, but was a child when Umber was here before as a child. And so it kind of shows the age gap. Like most orcs only live to be about 15 years old at their oldest, unless they have some magical means of extending their life, like a Thrak or a druid character like a Throka Finefeather. So just like the Banshee scene before, several episodes ago, this was a nice chance to show Umber exactly how special he is. He's not just descended from one Thrak, he's actually descended from 2 Thraks, which gives him like double the chance of living a long time. The other big thing that happened in the scene was the Dusk Falcon kind of swooping in and sort of declaring war officially between these two different powers. The Dusk Falcon was definitely inspired by the Red Arrow from, I think it's Return of the King, that Theoden gets sent by Denethor, but I wanted it to be like a slightly more orcish version of it. So it was originally like the Red Falcon, but I was like, that sounds a little Power Rangers-y. And then I was like, ooh, what if it's like dark? The idea is it's like the dusk, right? Like the sun is setting on our peaceful relations, right? It's a dusk falcon. Very dramatic. And then the second half of the session was largely dominated by the Fire Fest, which was this big kind of orcish welcoming ceremony. I want to talk a little bit about the world building there that was kind of fun. I wanted to have it in these different little stages. So the way we structured it is that I would describe like, okay, the first part of the festival is sort of like this. And this is what the orcs do, and this is kind of what you're expected to do, and then let's do a scene with kind of within the confines of that. So rather than just like you're marching and you can do whatever, it's like assume this is going on in the background. What is your character up to? So the first element of it was like the invitation. Throka Many-Mother, and then the I think Javshar is the orcish word for kind of like the mayor of this small town, Kostrak, that they're staying at, invited Chimera, who's the the Thrak of her company, to come forward and for her family to come and share a fire with them. But then all the other orcish families in this small village, or this burg, which is the orcish term, start to invite other groups of mercenaries to come to their fires. Kind of the conceit is that they're bragging about like, well, I have the best drink and I have the best food and I know the best story and oh, my son knows how to play this instrument really well. Like all these different things to advertise why their fire is actually the best fire, right? So it almost is kind of like a street fair angle, right? Of these like barkers trying to get people to come in. After that, then they then had a big feast and they were eating, different animals, whether it's aurochs or Indricathir is a big creature we have living in the cradle, lots of prehistoric kind of animals like that. And then the last part of the Fire Fest was the thing I was the most excited about, but the party didn't really take to very much, which is kind of disappointing. Like, that's okay, sometimes that happens. But it's the sport of Khla. So the idea is that the orcs would have some kind of like an intramural sport that they would play amongst the different burgs of the cradle. And I wanted to have it be a unique sport that is true to the orcish culture, but also, draws on inspiration from other sports, but it's not like completely out there. So I think of Khla as being kind of a combination of a little bit of Hyali and a little bit of Lacrosse, and there's a little bit of Notleikr, the Icelandic ball game, in there as well. The way it works is that each player has like a kind of Hyali style, like big complicated gauntlet that then has 2 long sort of claws that come out from it. And then there's a leather ball, right? And there's 2 teams of like 6 on each team. And the goal is to try to scoop up the ball with this claw and then whip it using this gauntlet towards the kind of signposts on either end. Rather than being like a field goal where it's like an opening, it's a single post that then has like different painted sections on it, right? There's like the 1 point, the 3 point, and the 5 point. And so, you're trying to get as many of these points as you can. What makes it quintessentially Orcish, though, is that there is an additional position. There's like 6 orcs on each side. And that additional position is held by a wolf. Often it's a warg, but it's sometimes a lycanthrope who takes the form of an ordinary wolf. The wolf does not play on any team, but is just kind of there to create chaos and to be this sort of adversarial force, right? To grab the ball and run around, and the orcs have to chase down the wolf. And so it's just like a goofy thing that I wanted to introduce, and I like the idea of maybe this being a plot line throughout the rest of their time in the cradle, is that like they get, recruited into Khla Claw League and then like go to the different burgs and compete in kind of a like state championship sort of sports movie, which I thought would be a fun like underpinning to the very serious war going on. But the players didn't really engage with it very much. They had a lot more important character scenes to do, so hopefully Khla will come back. This isn't the end of Khla by any means, but I was a little bit disappointed. Those character scenes were really good, though, and I'll talk about them super briefly. So Remoras had a scene with Displacer, a very brief one. Displacer is an old veteran of the Night Wars and was one of the people who was present during whatever happened at Khla Cross. So we've been kind of teasing that here and there. This didn't reveal too much about it, but it was a nice little touchstone, Hallie kind of going back to a character that she hadn't really talked to in a while, so it was nice to do that. Umber and Dunya finally sort of broke up, and it went pretty well. I wasn't sure how Dunya was going to feel about Umber at the end of all of this, and he used a sort of a stored natural 20 that he had thanks to our inspiration system, and he was able to kind of smooth things over with her. So they have parted amicably, and everything is going to be fine. He did speak to Throka Thrak about potentially getting her sort of like bone treatment done to see if she might be able to walk again. So that's going to happen in an upcoming session. They managed to separate without necessarily like getting, too adversarial. So I think they're going to remain friends even after this happens. I'm curious to see Dunya's life kind of post-procedure and post monarchy. Like, what is she like now just as a regular mercenary? She also took on a new title. She is now being called Turtle. There was a plot line where she had hoped that she was going to be called Dragon. She heard some people refer to her as Dragon, but they were actually calling her Dragon Turtle. And so her new nickname is now Turtle, and it's kind of a sign of her, like, embracing the fact that she is not as cool as maybe she thinks she is if her nickname is, Turtle. And then lastly, Griffin had that little scene about his lycanthropy. So I should talk about lycanthropy really quickly here. In On Dune, lycanthropy is a religious procedure that was invented by the orcs. Like, turning into an animal was seen as being this kind of sacred gift that the orcs would give out. The notion of kind of like a ravenous, monstrous version of a lycanthrope is something that only came about when other peoples, mainly humans, were exposed to it. When orcs practice lycanthropy, it's this very controlled, very spiritual thing, and it's something that Griffin went through many years ago as a younger half-orc, living amongst a different corv, but had kind of a similar experience. And that was traumatic for him. You have to go through these 3 trials of lycanthropy, and they kind of tax the body and the mind and the soul. And it's not something that every orc can pass through sort of unscathed. And Griffin definitely has some baggage to unpack about that. So mechanically what we're doing is we're still reintroducing these flashes. The idea is that when it comes up or someone talks to him about it, he makes a wisdom save, and then he might get thrown back into a memory that pertains to his time among this other core of the Ushrami core, where he learned his lycanthropic skill. But it's all still very mysterious, so I will save some of the spoilers for another time. But I'm curious, do you think that Umber should assume his responsibilities to the Throka Corv and become the Sharag, or do you think that he should stay amongst the company? When everything is said and done, should Umber retire and return home, or should he go out on another contract with his mother and his brother? Leave your comments below. I would be curious to see sort of like which side you land on. I am pleased to announce that the subscribe button has invited you to share their Cookfire. So just ring the bell, let everybody know that they are invited to come on in and click that subscribe button. I have no ulterior motive in asking you to do this. As always, this episode is brought to you by my patrons on Patreon. If you look below, you can find all the links to my social media, including the Patreon. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider becoming a member of that campaign. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy adventuring.